In the sun-scorched plains of the American frontier, where the wind carried dust and distant howls of coyotes, there lived a boy named Jonah. He was 10 years old, small for his age, with sunburnt skin and eyes that noticed everything: the tracks in the dirt, the clouds shifting above, the way horses flicked their ears when they sensed danger. He belonged to a modest ranching family who lived miles from the nearest town. Life was simple, and tough days spent fixing fences, herding cattle, and hauling water under the blazing sky. Jonah had no brothers, no sisters, and very few neighbors. But he had a quiet strength, the kind only the wild teaches. He was a cowboy, in every sense, not just in boots and hat, but in heart and soul. Their ranch sat near the outer edges of tribal land, a place where tension always simmered. Stories drifted in from the town about attacks, thefts, and violence. Most white settlers viewed the native people with fear or suspicion. Children were warned to stay away from the woods and to never trust anyone with feathers in their hair. Jonah, however, didn't see the world through grown-up eyes. His mind wasn't shaped by hatred or fear, only curiosity and instinct. And it was that instinct that changed his life forever, one dry, sweltering afternoon. While walking near the creek bed, now nothing but a cracked trail of dirt, he heard something faint, a rustling in the tall grass, the sound of movement, too soft to be a deer, too light to be a predator. He followed it, barefoot, heart thumping with something he couldn't explain. That's when he saw the small figure crouched low, trembling, and covered in dust. A child, no older than himself, their clothes torn, skin scraped, and eyes wide with terror. It was clear they didn't belong to any settler family. The paint on the cheeks had faded, but the marks were there. This was a native child alone, wounded, and far from home. And, in that moment, as the sun beat down and the prairie stood still, Jonah made a choice that most would never dare. A choice that would shape not just his life, but the destiny of two souls from two different worlds. Jonah stood frozen, staring at the wounded child hiding near the dry creek bed. The child's breathing was shallow, their body bruised and trembling from exhaustion. It was clear they had been alone for days, lost, possibly chased, and now teetering between survival and collapse. Jonah didn't know who they were, where they had come from, or why they were alone. But he didn't need to. He recognized something deeper: fear, pain, and the desperate need for help. The world he lived in had taught him that people like this child were to be feared or avoided. But what he saw before him was not a threat. It was just another child, like him, caught in something far bigger than either of them could understand. Without hesitation, Jonah moved to help. He brought the child to the edge of his family's land, where an old, unused barn stood hidden behind tall brush and dry wood. It was a quiet place where no one would think to look. There, among forgotten tools and hay, he created a small space of safety. For several days, Jonah cared for the child in secret. He stole bits of food from the kitchen: bread, dried meat, and a canteen of water. He cleaned the child's wounds with torn cloth and whispered reassurances he wasn't even sure the other understood. They rarely spoke. Words weren't needed. Trust was earned not through language, but through quiet gestures. Each night, Jonah snuck out of his home, past his sleeping parents, to check on the child. He brought blankets when the wind grew cold and sat beside them until they drifted into sleep. He never asked for a name. The child never gave one. Still, something unspoken passed between them, an invisible thread of connection that didn't care about bloodlines or borders. Jonah knew he was risking punishment not just from his parents, but from others in town if they found out. People didn't look kindly on those who helped their so-called enemies, but he couldn't turn his back. As the days passed, the child slowly began to heal. The color returned to their cheeks, and the fear in their eyes faded just enough to show a spark of life again. And when Jonah realized the child was strong enough to leave, he knew what he had to do. He guided them through a hidden path behind the hills, a quiet trail leading back toward the forest and the lands the tribe still called home. At the edge of the trees, the child turned once, as if memorizing Jonah's face. Then they reached into their torn tunic and pulled out a small object, a feather bound with leather string and colored beads, and placed it in Jonah's hand. There were no words, only a long, steady look. And then the child disappeared into the trees, leaving Jonah alone with a dusty sky above, and a feeling deep in his chest he couldn't explain. It would be years before he understood what that moment truly meant. The sun was beginning to set, as Jonah stood at the edge of the forest, watching the figure disappear into the thick wall of trees. The dry wind tugged at his shirt, and the world seemed quiet, unusually quiet, as if nature itself was pausing to witness what had just taken place. In his hand, Jonah held the small object the child had given him, a single feather tied with thin leather, adorned with tiny glass beads of blue, red, and white. It was simple, but it held weight, not just in his palm, but somewhere deeper in his heart, in his memory, in whatever it was inside him that now felt different. He didn't know what the token meant, not exactly, but he felt it had meaning, a sign of thanks, a symbol of trust, a silent promise between two children who had met for a brief, impossible moment between two very different worlds. As he walked back to the ranch, Jonah felt changed. He had done something no one would ever know about, something kind, something dangerous, something completely against what everyone in town would have told him to do. Yet he felt no regret, only a quiet sense of peace. He tucked the feather away inside a wooden box beneath his bed, hidden beneath scraps of old paper and a marble he'd once found near the river. It stayed there, untouched, as days turned to weeks and the season shifted. No one ever found out what Jonah had done. No one asked. The injured child became a memory, a private truth held close to his chest, something he never shared, not even when years later he was teased by other boys or scolded by the old men at the trading post who told wild stories about raids and war. To everyone else, he was just Jonah, the quiet boy who worked the land and kept to himself. But he remembered. He remembered the eyes of the child he helped, the way they had looked at him in that final moment. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something unspoken, something ancient, as if the land had borne witness and was waiting to bring that moment full circle. And though Jonah didn't know it yet, that circle would close in time. Because the child he saved was not lost forever, they were simply becoming something greater. And one day they would return, with a surprise no one would expect. The boy named Jonah had grown into a quiet, hard-working man. Life on the ranch remained much the same: long days, rough hands, and little time to dream. The world around him had changed, but inside he carried the same steady heart. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, a group of riders appeared at the edge of town. They weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with grace, with quiet pride, wearing colors and patterns that spoke of tribal honor. Their presence turned heads and drew silence. Among them was one rider who dismounted with purpose, tall, calm, with a strong gaze and quiet strength. Something about him felt familiar, though Jonah couldn't place it at first. Then he saw it tied around the man's neck was a faded feather, adorned with blue, red, and white beads. It was the same one Jonah had once been given. The rider walked straight to him with no fear, no hesitation. In his presence, Jonah felt the weight of time, of memories buried but not forgotten. This was no longer a child. This was a leader, shaped by the land, by survival, and by the kindness of a boy from long ago. Rider didn't come with demands or warnings. He came with purpose, with gratitude, with something Jonah never expected to receive. Recognition. The tall rider stood before Jonah, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. Without words, he reached into a satchel and pulled out a carefully wrapped bundle. Inside was a hand-carved object, a symbol of honor from his people, offered with both pride and humility. It wasn't just a gift. It was a repayment of a debt not of obligation, but of the heart. The rider had returned not only as a leader among his own people, but as someone who had never forgotten the boy who once showed him compassion when the world had turned away. Jonah, though surprised, didn't speak much. He never had. But in his eyes there was understanding, a quiet knowing that even small acts done in silence can echo for years. The man who had once been a lost child left with his head held high, and Jonah, still rooted in the same soil, stood a little taller that day. Some stories are loud and filled with glory, but this one, the one of a boy, a feather, and a silent bond, lived forever in the space where kindness and fate quietly meet.